Hi, welcome. Enjoy the content, subscribe, and turn on notifications.
Marshall and Claire lived in Cedar Hill, a quiet town where not much changed and everyone's faces were familiar. Married for over 20 years, they were seen as a model of stability. There were no frequent arguments between them, no obvious emotional distance, or any visible signs of wear and tear. Their relationship ran so smoothly that, to anyone who knew them, it seemed they had achieved a rare kind of closeness, one that only comes with time and the absence of major upheavals. Marshall was a calm, practical, and responsible man. He worked as a maintenance technician for a network of public schools, a job that required organization, attention to detail, and the ability to handle unexpected problems. He was the type who preferred routine over spontaneity, someone who liked solving problems with as little drama as possible. Claire, on the other hand, had a completely different energy, though not different values. She chose to be a homemaker and was highly active in the community, especially at church, where she enthusiastically devoted herself to all kinds of volunteer work. On Sundays, they were always together at the morning service. During the week, they naturally shared household responsibilities. Claire took care of the house with care, prepared meals, managed the bills, and still found time to coordinate charity efforts with the church women's group. Marshall, in turn, kept the house in order, handled repairs, paid bills on time, and made sure to set aside evenings to spend together. It was common to see them walking in the late afternoon, having coffee in the backyard on Saturdays, or sitting side by side on the living room couch watching their favorite shows. There was no awkward silence between them, just comfort, predictability, and a sense of security that both seemed to value more than anything else. Claire was known around town for her generosity. She was the one who organized charity bazaars, collected food during seasonal campaigns, and prepared meals distributed to shelters in the area. Her work with homeless people was perhaps what affected her the most emotionally. She treated them with special care, a kind of compassion that went beyond simply handing out a meal. Claire would talk to them, ask their names, remember their stories. Whenever someone new showed up in line, she made it a point to find out where they came from, whether they needed anything else, or if they already had shelter for the night. This level of involvement was admired by everyone, including Marshall, who took pride in his wife's dedication and the way she touched people's lives without losing her warmth. She spent many afternoons at church, preparing food baskets, sorting clothes, organizing lists. It was during one of those afternoons that Claire met Victor. He showed up for the first time on a cloudy morning, during a food distribution event in the church's side courtyard. He was clean, dressed in simple but decent clothes, and had a look in his eyes different from the others who came around. He didn't seem confused or apathetic. On the contrary, he observed everything with attention and politeness. When it was his turn in line, he thanked her for the food in a firm voice, looked her straight in the eyes, and said it had been a long time since he'd eaten something prepared with such care. She smiled, as she did with everyone, and responded kindly. But even though that first interaction was brief, something about the way he carried himself stayed with her that day. Victor came back in the following days. He would sit quietly in a corner, wait his turn, eat in silence, and always say thank you. Gradually, he started talking to Claire, first with short sentences, then with small stories. He said he didn't drink, that he stayed at the downtown shelter, and that he liked to read whenever he could get donated books. She began setting aside specific things for him, better blankets, new pairs of socks, little acts of kindness that, to her, were just part of her usual work, but to Victor seemed to carry more weight. At first, there was no sign of anything deeper. He was just one more person Claire helped with dedication. But something about his calm, respectful gaze, that almost proud posture despite his situation, began to draw her attention without her even realizing it. And without knowing it, what started as a simple kindness between strangers was about to become the beginning of something no one could have predicted. In the weeks following their first meeting, Claire began noticing that Victor became a regular presence at the church's outreach events. Always clean, polite, and discreet, he was unlike anything she associated with the typical image of a homeless person. He never asked for more than what was offered. He never insisted on seconds or tried to take extra items. He accepted everything with a kind of dignity that seemed out of place given his circumstances. Without even realizing it, Claire started looking for him every time she arrived at church. When he was there, she felt strangely more energized. When he didn't show up, a quiet unease followed her until the end of the day. One day, while organizing donated blankets, Victor approached with a shy smile and said she reminded him of someone. Surprised, Claire asked him to tell her more. He explained that his wife's name was also Claire, and that she had been a woman with a similar spirit, always involved in social causes. That coincidence opened the door to a longer conversation. He told her that for over 20 years, he had owned a high-end furniture store. He was married, had his own house, a car, a comfortable life. He said his wife was diagnosed with a brain aneurysm, and after she passed away, something inside him just shut down. In a moment of despair, he sold the store, tried investing the money in a poorly planned new project, and lost everything within a few months. Debts piled up, accounts were frozen, and soon he found himself without a home, without savings, without anything. He cut ties with his family, refused help from friends, and started wandering the streets with no direction. He didn't drink, didn't use drugs, wasn't violent. He just gave up on a life that, for him, only made sense when she was by his side. Claire listened in silence. And there, for the first time, something inside her shifted in a different way. It wasn't just compassion. It was recognition. It was the feeling of seeing in Victor a kind of silent grief she had never experienced herself, but somehow understood. In the days that followed, she began setting aside better food for him, preparing extra portions under the excuse that there was leftover, and suggesting he stay a little longer after distributions to help organize the tables. No one thought it was strange. She had always been close to the people she helped. But the frequency with which the two of them began talking would have raised eyebrows, if anyone had been paying closer attention. Time passed, and their conversations grew deeper. Victor spoke about life before his breakdown, about dreams cut short, about the pain he still felt when remembering his wife. Claire, in turn, started sharing personal details she usually kept to herself. She talked about her life with Marshall, about how sometimes she felt invisible, about the lack of newness in her daily routine. She wasn't complaining about her husband. She was just expressing how she felt. Victor listened with patient eyes, like someone who knew what it was like to be trapped in a quiet life. And in that space of listening and empathy, an intimacy began to form. An intimacy that wasn't physical at first, but slowly started taking up dangerous space inside her. Their first meeting outside of church happened by chance. Claire was returning from a pharmacy and, as she turned onto a side street farther from downtown, she saw Victor sitting under the shade of a tree, reading a book. He smiled when he saw her and stood up naturally. They talked for a few minutes, she offered him a fruit from her bag, and he accepted. They sat on the nearby bench and kept talking as if it were just part of their routine. From that day on, more meetings began to happen. At first, they occurred around the same time as church events, then later at times completely separate from the church schedule. Claire chose neutral, quiet places, always telling herself internally that she was still just listening to someone who needed to be heard. But she knew. She knew this connection was no longer part of her volunteer work. She knew it wasn't just empathy anymore. The way she looked at Victor had changed. So had the way she prepared to see him. She spent more time styling her hair, choosing her clothes more carefully, wearing perfume, things she hadn't done even for Sunday services. And Victor changed too. He started complimenting her, remembering details from their conversations, looking for her with eager eyes. There was no exact moment when everything crossed the line. It was a slow, silent slide, like walking with your eyes open towards something you know you shouldn't, but can't stop. Their first kiss happened in a side hallway of the shelter where Claire volunteered once a week. She had brought a box of donations to the storage room, and Victor was there helping with the organization. They talked about ordinary things, laughed at something unimportant, and when they both turned to leave, he held her arm for just a second longer. She didn't pull away. And then it happened. It wasn't impulsive or urgent. It was calm, almost reverent. And unlike what she expected, Claire didn't immediately feel guilt. She felt peace. A kind of inner silence she didn't realize she'd been searching for, but found in that moment. From then on, their meetings became more regular. Always brief, always in discreet places, always with the risk of being seen. But never planned. Everything was driven by the need to be together, by a urgency they both knew wouldn't lead to a future, but couldn't stop. For the first few months, Claire kept up her routine just like always. She left for church at the same times, returned with the same calmness, continued taking care of the house without giving anyone reason to suspect anything. Marshall didn't suspect a thing. His wife's behavior was exactly the same as always, and there were no sudden changes to alert him. But others involved in church activities started noticing small differences. Thomas, a fellow church member and volunteer, began to notice that Claire frequently disappeared for longer periods during meal distributions. She said she was organizing donations or handling urgent matters, but some of those excuses didn't match how long she was gone. He started seeing that whenever Victor was around, Claire seemed more animated, and the two of them talked privately more than would be expected. His discomfort grew. Thomas knew Claire well, respected her reputation, but something about their closeness bothered him. One day, Claire left church at an unusual time, with no scheduled event. Thomas, who was nearby, decided to follow her, driven by an instinct he couldn't ignore. He kept his distance, staying out of sight. Claire walked a few blocks and met Victor in front of an old, abandoned school. They talked, looked around, and quietly slipped through a side entrance of the building. Thomas approached carefully. Through a gap in the rusted gate, he saw the two of them hugging. A few seconds later, they kissed naturally, as if repeating something familiar. It wasn't doubt or misunderstanding. It was an affair. He walked away quietly, disturbed. He knew he couldn't ignore what he'd seen. The next afternoon, he went to Marshall's house. They sat on the porch, like they'd done many times before, but what Thomas had to say didn't fit that peaceful setting. With clarity and respect, he told Marshall everything he had witnessed. Marshall listened in silence, without interrupting. He stayed completely still, as if absorbing each word without wanting to believe it. At the end, he thanked Thomas, stood up, and said goodbye. He walked into the house with a fixed stare and a stiff body. Marshall found Claire in the kitchen, distractedly moving pots around as if trying to keep busy so she wouldn't have to think. He pulled out a chair and, with a calmness that felt more dangerous than any shout, asked her to sit down. The silence between them was heavy. Claire, uncomfortable, obeyed. "Where were you yesterday afternoon?" he asked, staring straight at her. She took a moment to answer, as if needing a second to come up with something. "I stopped by my sister's house from church," she said, her voice firm, trying to sound convincing. Marshall didn't look away. "Are you sure about that?" he pressed, without changing his tone. "Of course I am," she replied, now irritated, trying to flip the situation. "Are you really doubting my word?" He took a deep breath, rested his elbows on the table, and let the silence eat at her for a few seconds. Then, without raising his voice, he said, "You know, Claire, people came to me, people who respect me, who had no reason to make up stories. And they told me you were at the school, kissing Victor." It was as if the ground had opened beneath her. The color drained from her face, and for a few seconds she couldn't react. She tried to laugh, nervously. "That's ridiculous. You actually believe gossip?" she said, her eyes filling with tears, still trying to hold on to the lie. Marshall didn't respond. He just kept looking at her. The firmness of his silence was more devastating than any accusation. Claire began to tremble. She brought her hands to her face, and finally, the tears spilled over. I didn't want it to be like this, she whispered, her voice breaking. I swear I didn't plan anything. She sobbed uncontrollably, words tumbling over each other in desperation. I made a mistake, Marshall. I lost my way. But I never stopped loving you. It was a mistake, a damn mistake. He listened until the end, motionless, like a statue of ice. When she reached out to touch his hand, he pulled away. You should pack your things, Claire. Today. His voice was low, but filled with a firmness that left no room for argument. And know that I won't hide anything. The church will find out. In 2 days, I'm filing for separation. Claire cried and begged for a chance, saying she could change, that there was still time to save the marriage. But Marshall simply stood up, turned, and walked out of the kitchen without looking back. She stayed behind, collapsed over the table, her sobs echoing through the quiet house, knowing nothing she said would change his mind. Claire left the house the same day, taking only a few suitcases with clothes and documents. She didn't have anywhere to go immediately, so she spent the night at a small downtown hotel, using part of her personal savings. The feeling of being alone was suffocating, but there was no time for long regrets. The next morning, she sent a message to the church leadership, asking for a meeting. She wanted to explain herself, hoping she might still be able to keep her volunteer role. She still held on to the hope that, at least there, she might find some kindness. The reply came quickly. They scheduled the meeting for 1 week later, in a room at the back of the church. Claire arrived early, looking worn out, her eyes sunken from crying. The meeting was brief and harsh. The leaders were already aware of the situation, and although they hadn't made public judgments, they decided she could no longer participate in outreach activities. They explained that, given the internal fallout, her continued presence would cause discomfort, tension, and drive away other volunteers. They said they were praying for her recovery, but it would be better if she stepped away indefinitely. Claire didn't argue. She just nodded and left before the tears exposed her even more. Without a home and without the church, there was only one option left, her parents' house. She hadn't spent more than a few hours with them in years, and even then only during formal occasions like religious holidays. She knew she wouldn't be warmly welcomed, but she had no other choice. She called her mother late in the afternoon and told her what had happened. The response was silence for a few seconds, followed by a heavy sigh. They said she could come, but not to expect a warm welcome. When Claire arrived that evening, her father greeted her coldly, without hugs or comforting words. Her mother, though more restrained, made it clear they were deeply ashamed. At dinner, they laid out the rules plainly. She could stay for a maximum of 6 months. Enough time to find a job, save some money, and leave. They wouldn't help with contacts or recommendations. This was her chance to start over on her own. Claire listened in silence, aware that she deserved every word. The bed she used was from her old childhood room, now turned into a makeshift storage space. There was no room for sweet memories in that place. It was just somewhere to spend the nights while she tried to rebuild something from the pieces that remained. The following week, she started looking for work. She sent resumes to supermarkets, stores, bakeries. She knocked on doors asking for any opportunity. But her name was circulating around town. Many people knew about the scandal, even if no one talked about it openly. And with that came closed doors. Some said the position was already filled, others simply refused without explanation. The embarrassment was constant. She saw faces that once greeted her at church turn away when they saw her on the street. Old friends disappeared. Nothing of her old life remained. With no formal options, she started taking odd jobs. She began cleaning houses for acquaintances who, out of pity, offered work without questions. Then she started doing laundry and other small tasks at odd hours. The money was little, barely covering basic needs, but it was enough to buy hygiene products, pay for small meals out, and slowly save a modest amount. After 4 months, she had just enough to take the next step, renting a small studio apartment on the edge of a neighborhood far from anything that reminded her of her past life. The place was tiny, with peeling paint, donated furniture, and poor ventilation. But it was hers. For the first time in months, Claire had a key, a bed, a corner where she could be without the daily weight of judgment. She still struggled, still relied on occasional work, still cried in silence. But now there was a thread of independence, even if thin. The wounds were far from healed, and loneliness was a constant companion. Still, within that cramped space, she began to understand what it meant to live without applause, without pats on the back, without the reputation that once held her up. Just with herself. Claire's fall pulled others down with her, in different ways. Victor, once seen as a rare example of respect and gratitude among the homeless, became the target of suspicious looks. Church leadership didn't wait long to act. They met among themselves and discreetly informed him that he could no longer attend the charity events held there. The reason was straightforward, with no explanations or ceremony. His presence had caused internal divisions, and the church couldn't risk another scandal. Victor listened without reacting. He just nodded and walked away, carrying the small bag with the few belongings he still had. In the days that followed, he was seen again near the municipal shelter, but he no longer approached missions or church-linked food distribution points. He didn't try to reconnect with Claire or publicly defend what had happened. He disappeared into the city's corners with the same quietness with which he had once appeared. It was as if he accepted returning to anonymity as something inevitable. There was no drama, no promises of change. Just the silence of someone who knows their time in a certain place has ended. He was going back to square one, but now without the only support system that had reached out to him in recent times. Claire, meanwhile, remained isolated in her new reality. The studio she lived in was a world apart from the life she once knew. There were no visitors, no phone calls, no invitations. Her days were filled with manual labor, physical effort, and a loneliness that weighed heavier at night, when the silence of the apartment seemed to amplify everything she had lost. For a while, she tried finding comfort in reading Bible passages, but the words felt distant. The place where she once found faith now brought discomfort. She couldn't step into a church without feeling eyes on her, real or imagined. The spirituality that once moved her had become a painful territory. She didn't say she was turning away from God, but she didn't know how to reconnect either. On the rare occasions she ran into someone from the past, greetings were cold, mechanical. No one openly attacked her, but the rejection was obvious. She lived like a shadow of who she used to be, with no plans to return, no hope of reconciliation. Her days followed predictable cycles, limited to survival, marked by memories that wouldn't fade. She was aware of the choices she'd made, and though she didn't see herself as a victim, the pain of exclusion was unavoidable. She knew regaining trust would be nearly impossible, and maybe that's why she didn't even try anymore. Marshall, on the other hand, didn't stay frozen in time, but he wasn't untouched either. He switched churches a few months after the divorce, seeking a fresh start far from the memories that surrounded him. In the new congregation, he was polite and helpful, but kept a clear emotional distance. He avoided talking about the past, and when asked, simply said he'd gone through a difficult separation. He didn't go into details, didn't criticize Claire, but his eyes revealed a man still carrying open wounds. The members of the new church respected his silence, but it was impossible not to notice the hardness that had settled into his actions. Once friendly, now more reserved. Once open, now restrained. He was a different man, shaped not by anger, but by pain. The years that followed passed in silence among the three. Claire never tried to contact Marshall again. Victor remained on the streets, and no one in the religious community ever heard from him again. Marshall rebuilt parts of his life, but never remarried. Not for lack of opportunity, but because he seemed to have closed that chapter completely. People quietly commented that he still carried a love that had been cruelly betrayed. But he never confirmed it. The story, which began as a reflection of generosity and faith, ended as a painful portrait of how quiet decisions can lead to permanent breaks. There were no shouts, no public scandals. Just poor choices, poorly kept secrets, and consequences that, once set in motion, could never be undone. Trust, as many said in hushed tones, is like a mirror. Once broken, even if glued back together, it's never the same again. Thank you for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you won't miss any updates. See you next time.